Raise your hand. Who of you uses open source projects? And raise your hand. Who of you submitted an issue or pull request to open source projects? And finally, who of you runs or maintains their own open source project? Wow, that's really cool. So almost everyone in this room interacts with open source projects in some way. I'm Felix Krause. I'm at KrauseFX at Twitter, and I'm the creator of Fastlane, an open source tool that allows you to publish apps to the App Store very easily. And out of curiosity, raise your hand. Who of you uses Fastlane or used it in the past? Cool. That's great to see. So I went to to a Fastlane meetup this Wednesday here in Tokyo, and I got this really cool T-shirt. So thank you so much for that. It says, I know a little bit about Fastlane. So I was lucky enough to grow a small side project to a tool that is now part of Google with over 12,000 commits and 13,000 stars on GitHub. Fastlane is very actively being developed by over 500 external contributors and was recently named as one of the most active projects on GitHub. And in this talk, I want to share what I learned when scaling the project from 0 to tens of thousands of active users. In general, you can group open source projects into 4 different stages. Stage 1 is when you just publish some source code somewhere, like on GitHub. And usually you have no issues, no pull requests, and no stars yet. And around 40% of all GitHub projects have no interaction at all. Stage 2 is when other developers start using your software. So you might realize that when people start submitting issues or pull requests for your software. And this is already a really, really cool feeling. Stage 3 is when your software becomes the de facto standard for a specific problem. So you might realize that when people start recommending your software on Twitter or recommending it at conferences. And finally, stage 4 are hyperscale projects. And that means you get hundreds of notifications every day. People might start attacking your project, like they write tweets or blog posts against it. And there might be commercial versions built on top or using your software. And finally, some of these projects are actually start right on stage 4. So for example, React Native by Facebook started directly as a hyperscale project because it became successful immediately. I was lucky enough to go through all these stages with Fastlane. And I learned a lot over the last 2 years, but not so much about coding or design patterns, but more about the human factor of open source software. So things like how to best interact with people on GitHub, how to enable contributors to have the highest impact, and finally also how to provide support for large-scale open source projects. So first I want to talk very quickly about some of the problems you will face as your project grows, and finally about some of the solutions you can apply for your own project. Let's start with the project momentum. The bigger your project becomes, the harder it is to keep the innovation you had in the beginning of your project. You have to consider hundreds of use cases and thousands of different production setups, so you cannot just remove an option or change a default value. And another big part of this is also handling the support. So once you pass a few thousand active users, you will realize that you spend more time helping your users than actually writing code for your project. So this graph up here shows that I spend twice as much time on GitHub than I do in my text editor. But most GitHub issues are not actually issues, but they are feature requests or questions. So you have to decide how you want to receive feature requests for your projects. You can either have people submit GitHub issues and then you would label them accordingly, or you can have a separate website where people can submit ideas and features and other developers can upvote or comment on them. And finally, you can say that you don't accept any new features at all and your project is feature frozen. And in general, all features have to align with your project vision. So you should have a way to say no to a specific feature request or pull request if you don't agree with them. So for Fastlane, very often the following happened. Somebody says Fastlane should make the coffee in the morning. And you would think, okay, that's probably not something we want to do for Fastlane. So I would add a comment that says, sorry, this doesn't fit into the Fastlane vision. We don't want to implement that right now. And I would close the issue. Can you guess what we get as a reply? People would say, oh, I got up this morning and there was no coffee on my table. What's wrong? And so you have to justify yourself on why you don't want to implement something. And very similarly to features, you also have to decide what pull requests to merge into your code base. Because once a change is merged into your code base, you have to test and support this in all future releases. And trust me, if the feature breaks sometime in the future, you will be the one who has to fix it. So in general, reviewing and testing pull requests takes almost as much time as writing the code for it. So you as a maintainer work on a thing you think is currently most important for your project, and then you receive an external pull request, so you have to interrupt what you're currently doing just to review this pull request. So this is really, really hard to balance. And another problem you might face is that project maintainers stop being a user of the product. And this is something that happened to Fastlane too. The software was started because the project maintainer needed the software for themselves. So they built this software and suddenly they work on it full time. And with that, they stopped the activity they've been doing before. And so actually, that's why they stopped being a user of the product. And the challenge is to still somehow use your software so that you realize how to best spend your time. And if that's not, for example, with Fastlane, we actually use Fastlane to deploy Fastlane. So everybody working on it also uses the product. And so if that's not possible for your product, make sure to onboard yourself, like set up the project yourself just to, get a feel of how you should spend your time. And there is a big information imbalance between the project maintainers and the users. For you as a maintainer, it is just another issue. But for the user, this is everything. This issue is 100% of the interaction this user has with your project. So this is probably something they will remember for a really, really long time. And this first hit me when I attended my first WWDC last year, and somebody walked up to me and asked me very specific questions about this one issue they submitted a while ago, assuming that I would remember that particular issue. And so for you as a maintainer, it's an issue that has to be prioritized. But for the user, this issue is everything, and it might actually keep them from using your product. But now to the more interesting part of the presentation, how to scale your open source project. So with Fastlane, we've tried many different approaches to keep the GitHub project healthy, and we're still learning and experimenting a lot. However, we already found some really good solutions, and in this talk, I want to share some of the best of them. So first off, improve your error messages. No matter how good your software actually is, you will always run into unexpected situations. So the way you show them is very, very important. I'm going to show you two exact same error messages. However, they're shown differently in Fastlane. This is how we've used to show error messages in Fastlane. You would see the complete stack trace and a lot of error information. And this is very overwhelming for most users. So we've updated Fastlane to look more like this. You see the actual error message in red, and you get a very nice summary of what went wrong. And we even went ahead and post Stack Overflow links in error messages. We went ahead and print out commands that allow the user to reproduce the error. And finally, we even show extra debug information, like the certificate ID. And once you have great error messages, the next step is to make it as easy as possible to find similar existing issues. So when you receive a cryptic error message, what is the first thing you do? You usually search for the error message on GitHub or on Google. So you as a project maintainer should make it as easy as possible to do so. Ideally, the user sees all relevant discussion right when the error happens. So that's why Otter built GH Inspector, a Ruby gem that would show you similar GitHub issues right in the user's terminal. So whenever Fastlane runs into an unexpected situation, it will not only show all the similar GitHub issues, but also print a search URL on GitHub, allowing users to dive in even deeper. And if the user doesn't find an existing issue, they will probably go ahead and submit one on GitHub. So it is very important that you properly manage GitHub issues. And I'm not a big fan of the use of bots and automated messages. However, once you reach a certain scale, you have to have some kind of automated responses to reduce the support load. So in this section, I want to show you some of the main use cases of bots for open source projects. Providing all information in a bug report is really hard, even for us software engineers. GitHub recently introduced the issuetemplate.md document that autofills the new issue form with a given text. However, most people ignore that and just submit an issue without it. So very often in Fastlane, we would get an issue like this. It would have a lot of information missing, including the Fastlane version, which is necessary for us to help people. So using the Fastlane bot, we ensure that all required information is available, and if not, we tell the user how to provide them. You should make it very easy for users to provide all the information you need. So that's why we built this Fastlane env command, which is basically the same thing as podenv for CocoaPods. And it would fetch all the required data we need to help the user, like for example, the Ruby version, the OpenSSL version, or even the Fastlane plugins the user uses. And this makes it a lot easier to help people. And if you receive similar issues often, you should always step back and fix the underlying issue or improve the documentation. If 10 users submit a specific kind of hundreds of users felt the same way but didn't submit one. So in the case of Fastlane, many issues are related to code signing, but there is no ultimate solution to fix code signing if you are not Apple. So we wrote an extensive guide on how to set up code signing and how to troubleshoot problems. Turns out, most people don't like reading documentation unless you link them to the right spot, which is exactly what the Fastlane bot does. The key to handle large support for large-scale open source projects is to keep issues moving. You want to avoid having issues stall. You as iOS developers all know how frustrating it can be to submit a radar and then hear back 2 years later just to get a response that tells you to try again with the latest version of Xcode. Chances are very high there is no way for you to reproduce the issue again. And it's actually the same problem for open source projects. So maybe the user tried your software, submitted the issue, but then went with a different solution instead. Or sometimes people already found a workaround and they don't actually care about spending more time on the issue. And finally, maybe the user just switched company or team and doesn't have access to the source code anymore. So having a bot can ensure that all issues are still relevant and reproducible. For Fastlane, when an issue has no activity for over 2 months, the Fastlane bot will ask if the issue is still relevant with the most recent Fastlane release. If no one replies to the bot within a month, the issue gets auto-closed with a note that a new issue can be submitted for further discussion. And about a month after closing the issue, the bot will log the conversation so that no one can comment on it anymore. And that brings me to the next topic on why you should log old and inactive issues. Logging old and resolved issues is a great way to avoid resurfacing of GitHub issues from previous releases. For Fastlane, we experienced that users would comment on issues that kind of sound similar, but they're actually not related at all. Sometimes people would comment on issues that have a lot of subscribers, triggering unwanted email notifications for people who already found a workaround. And finally, the very famous Me Too comments on issues that only trigger email notifications but don't actually add any value to the discussion. So by telling users to submit a new GitHub issue, you properly go through the complete life cycle of a GitHub issue again. First, the user submits an issue. Then the Fastlane bot ensures that all required information is available. Then the actual discussion around the issue happens. And in the end, the issue either gets resolved or it gets auto-closed by the bot. So with all these bot techniques, how much did the Fastlane bot actually help? Just by introducing those few bot features, we reduced the number of open issues and pull requests dramatically. We went from over 700 open tickets to less than 300, and we stayed there for the last 8 months. Until now, we mostly covered issues, but a very essential part is also responding to pull requests. Your continuous integration server already verifies that all tests pass and that the code style follows your conventions. However, tests don't ensure the way how changes are introduced. That's why Orta and I set out to build Danger, a tool that allows you to define rules for pull requests, for code changes. So for example, you can do something like show a warning on GitHub if a certain file gets modified, or you can add new tests. You can require new tests if there's 20 new lines of code. And also, Danger can help with PR and runs. And this is an interesting thing you can see with many open source projects. Someone takes the time to submit a pull request and then submits it, and in the end, the build fails. And the author doesn't update the pull request to fix the tests. The reason for that is that GitHub has no notification for when the tests fail. So yeah, now you as a project maintainer has to go ahead and tell the user to fix the tests. And this is time you spend on something that should be completely automated. So by using Danger, you can add a comment, you can automatically add a comment to a pull request when the tests fail, triggering an email notification to the author and telling the user how to fix what tests have failed and how to fix them. And it is so important to work into the same direction. For open source projects, most communication happens asynchronously instead of having meetings. So it is a little harder to stay focused and to going into the right direction. Many bigger open source projects introduced a vision.md document that describes the bigger picture and the overall philosophy. As your user base grows, you want more people joining you on maintaining the project and pushing it forward. You want to increase the buzz factor as your project grows, meaning more and more people have push access and are familiar with your code base. So with a growing community, you need to make sure developers are in a safe environment. So one action you should take very early on in your project is to add a code of conduct. And make it very easy for people to contribute to your project. So if you're not on a monorepo, make sure to provide scripts that automatically check out all the repos and dependency the user needs to contribute to your project. And this is something many open source projects don't consider. The more complex your code base is, the more difficult for people it is to get started coding, and less people are able to contribute. Instead of using the latest Swift magic to save 4 lines of code, use the easiest to understand technique to solve a certain problem, making it easier for people to spot issues and contribute patches. And of course, to grow a community around your project, be as friendly and welcoming as you can. Thank people for submitting issues and pull requests, and ask people for help or clarification if needed. And when scaling your open source project, you have to say no to so many features and ideas. And to enable your project to still grow in a healthy way, you can implement various ways for users to extend your software. Many Ruby-based open source projects, including Fastlane, CocoaPods, and Bundler, offer a DSL, a domain-specific language, that allows developers to implement a very dynamic configuration. Instead of having static values like it is the case for YAML or JSON files, you can actually execute code in a fast file, gem file, or pod file. So this is extremely useful to fetch or generate values on demand. Here is an example Ruby DSL that allows users to pass static values, closures, or even call external methods and web services. The next step is it for people to allow people to extend your project without having to touch the code base. For Fastlane, when a user needs an integration that is not available yet, they can easily build and use a local action. Allowing local action is a great way in the beginning until users want to share the integrations with the rest of the community. Once that's the case, you need to provide an ecosystem for developers to share the integrations in the form of plugins. And while that's not possible for all kinds of projects, building a plugin architecture enables your project to grow at a much faster pace. Your dependency graph will stay slimmer, you might receive less pull requests, and your code base can stay smaller. And most platforms already have a great dependency manager available, so make sure to use that. At Fastlane, we use RubyGems and Bundler to make it easy for people to use plugins. And as a result, we already have 120 third-party plugins available within just a few months. Scaling open source projects is really hard, and you will face a lot of challenges as your project grows. Ideally, you're not the only person having to deal with the problems of a growing project, but you have contributors helping you. So if you face challenges, don't give up. Ask the community for help. Without the amazing Fastlane community, Fastlane would never be where it is now. Good open source projects stay alive for a really, really long time, and you can have an enormous impact on companies and developers around the world. And even if maintaining open source projects can be really hard sometimes, there is nothing more rewarding on seeing how your fellow developers are using your software. If you have more ideas on how to make open source better for both sides, please come say hi after this talk. I would love to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Felix. Thank you for great talk. I want to ask one question. Is there any library that you have not maintained? I mean, you left the library, and what did you do with that kind of product? I mean, libraries.
The question is what I do with libraries I don't maintain.
Yeah, you were concentrating, but not now. Like you are kind of bored with that framework.
Okay, so you publish the library.
Yeah.
People use it, but you're bored and you don't want to maintain it.
Is there any?
Yeah, that is a great question. So a lot of times people lose interest after they publish an open source project, and it is very important to communicate that very clearly. So if you are looking for someone else to take over, submit an issue or reach out to people who have contributed to your project. So you can tell people, hey, I don't have the time or I don't have the interest to work on it. Is anybody else interested in taking this over? And this way it is very transparent and people have a chance to step in.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Felix.
Thank you.